Welcome inside the War Room. I'm your host, Andrew Valancourt, and we're back today for episode 32 of the Dynasty War Room podcast. On today's show, we're going to take a look at the biggest questions ahead of week 2, talk about some week 2 sleepers and starts of the week, and examine whether it is time to panic about 10 different players who had rough showings in week 1. So we're going to take a look at that. And as always, if you've missed any of our previous shows, you can find them on your platform of choice. We're on everything out there. So wherever you're listening to us right now, make sure you follow the podcast, and that way you don't miss any of our future shows. And as always, find us on social media. We're on Twitter at Dynasty War Room. We have a Facebook page as well. And then on YouTube, go give us subscribe over there at Dynasty War Room. We appreciate that. And without further ado, let's just jump right into today's show. And first, I want to touch on the biggest takeaways from week 1. So we're on a bit of a different schedule throughout the summer and the off season. We were releasing episodes on Monday mornings. That's a little bit more difficult in season, which is why we didn't have a show this past Monday. So the schedule will be a little bit different, but we also, things might change a bit as we go. However, most shows will be released at some point, in this Tuesday to Friday window after games are finished. And so we haven't had a chance yet to discuss week 1. And there were a number of takeaways that I had. But number 1, it seems to me that the NFL has a quarterback problem. And I say that not entirely because of the quarterbacks. It's also just a bad offense kind of everywhere you look. But there really is a quarterback problem, in my opinion. I think you look around the league, there's not, that many quarterbacks that you look at and you go, yes, I trust this guy to run an offense. I know that, I can turn on the TV and I'm going to see good, solid offensive football, let alone players that you think you can trust in fantasy football. So a bit of a different, look that we had in week 1 with sort of these rough offenses across the board. And, you can go down the list. I counted out 15 different offenses that were just flat out bad, both real life, but especially in fantasy. And there's going to be a couple more teams that could be added to that list as well. So, Green Bay, a team that we expect to have a good offense, but Jordan Love is out. So we'll see how things shape up there over the next few weeks, but probably going to be a bit of a rough go. New Orleans had a great week 1 playing Carolina, but that team could fall back down to earth. Minnesota, same sort of situation, playing a subpar team in the Giants, and they could fall back to earth as well. So a lot of question marks. Patriots, Jets, Steelers, Bengals, Browns, Jags, Titans, Chargers, Raiders, Broncos, Commanders, Giants, Bears, Panthers, and Falcons. So there you go, kind of a long list. But none of those teams were really that great for fantasy football, especially. Not that there weren't a couple players here and there from those teams that had nice outputs in terms of fantasy points, but largely not a lot to be excited about from any of those teams. Jaden Daniels probably the single best for fantasy of that group, but he didn't exactly play that well either in terms of real life, especially throwing the ball. So a lot to improve on there, and that was sort of my overall take from week 1 was just wow, we've got some offenses that really need work as we head into week 2. Now, even among the teams that did have nice offensive weeks, I think we still saw, a lot of dud performances, right? There were just players all across the league that did not play up to their standards, did not give you the type of fantasy outlook that we would expect from those players. We saw guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown have a rough fantasy week, Drake London, Chris Olave, just a lot of kind of big names that went pretty early in drafts. Now, largely my advice will be, give it time. Don't be too worried about your studs. These guys will bounce back. They should be fine. We've seen them, produce in the past, at least in particular with, guys like St. Brown. But don't be too worried yet. Don't overreact to just 1 week. And we're going to talk about, overreacting to 1 week a bit later in the show when we get to our time to panic segment and where we, take a look at the panic meter for some of these players. But overall, I wouldn't worry too much about the big time players. It's some of the middling and lesser players that, you kind of have to see something early. And when you don't, that's when you might be in some trouble. So we'll check back next week on some of these big names, see how things shape up. But before we jump into our questions for week 2 or things that I'm going to be watching for in week 2, I do want to take a minute to just touch on some of the things that I think we've hit on early. Granted, it's only been 1 week, but players and teams and things that I feel like if you've been listening to this show, I can take a brief victory lap here already, given what we've seen. And I'm going to start with Josh Allen, who's a player that I told you was my QB1 in Dynasty for startups. I don't think that's necessarily an uncommon opinion, but it was something that there was a lot of, should it be Patrick Mahomes? Is it, CJ Stroud, Jalen Hurts? Do we look at one of the receivers? But I think you just go with the guy that you've seen it from over and over, and he dominated in week 1. He showed you that he can put your entire fantasy team on his back and keep you in games. So Josh Allen, still the QB1. Speaking of Josh Allen, Anthony Richardson was another player that I was very high on all offseason, and he had a great week 1 for fantasy football. I can see him as being a Josh Allen 2.0 for fantasy football, especially once he, improves on his passing game. He didn't, complete necessarily a ton of passes and whatnot, but very dynamic. We saw the deep balls. We saw, the rushing ability on the touchdown. So a lot to like out of Anthony Richardson in week 1 as well. Tucker Kraft. I've been talking about him all summer as a sleeper that I like, that based on the way that the Packers handled their offense at the end of the season last year and in the playoffs, Tucker Kraft was somebody that seemed poised to take over that starting job from Luke Musgraves. I got a little bit scared here in August, given the pectoral injury that Kraft had suffered from, and wondered if it would take some time before it happened. But based on week 1, Tucker Kraft was the starting tight end for the Green Bay Packers. So if you still have people in your leagues that are all in on Luke Musgrave and just refuse to recognize that Kraft is the guy, I think that now is probably going to be your last chance here while Jordan Love is injured to go out and get Tucker Kraft, because it sure seems to me, based on snap percentages and just participation in the offense, that Tucker Kraft is the guy there. So that's just something to keep an eye on. The Browns and the Jets, 2 teams that I railed on all offseason, just saying how much I really thought they were going to stink, especially, the quarterbacks between Deshaun Watson and Aaron Rodgers. And that certainly looks to be the case. I didn't see anything all that exciting about either one of those teams. So, again, we're going to talk about some of those guys later, but early victory lap on that before they have a bounce back, and I can't say it anymore. But I still am sticking to my guns there. I just don't believe in either offense. We saw David Njoku go down. Amari Cooper had a rough week, along with pretty much everybody on that offense outside of Jerome Ford, who I did recommend that you take a look at over the summer, because I don't think that Nick Chubb is really going to bring anything to the table anymore. And Garrett Wilson, who I ragged on a little bit in our last show, was okay, but didn't really establish himself as this elite option in week 1. But again, it's way too early to take any strong position on somebody like Garrett Wilson. However, Saquon Barkley, somebody I am willing to say absolutely is going to be in the fantasy MVP conversation. This, with the way that he performed in week 1. Just absolute monster, and think he's going to have a very productive season all the way through. So just a couple of quick victory laps there. At the end of the season, maybe at the midway point of the season, we'll do an episode on players that I was right on and players that I was wrong about, because there certainly are some candidates there that, I might not be exactly right on. So we'll see how things shape up later in the season. But for now, things that I am going to be looking for in week 2, questions I have, teams, offenses that I'm going to be watching a little bit closer than normal. And I'm going to start with Jacksonville, which is a team that, frankly, was really disappointing in week one. I mean, this was an offense that I loved all summer. I was telling you how much I love Evan Engram and Christian Kirk. Neither one of those players helped you in week one. Now, Trevor Lawrence was okay, made a nice throw in the end zone to Brian Thomas, who looks like he might be coming on a little bit sooner. But they just weren't able to do a lot offensively against Miami. So that's a team that I really need to see, some improvements from over the next week or two. I expect them to be there. I do expect Engram and Kirk to be much more involved in the offense, especially Evan Engram, who, has had some of the targets, just didn't have a lot there for him against Miami. So we'll see how things go. But the Jaguars offense is definitely something that I will be watching. The Green Bay Packers, another team that I'm going to be paying attention to. I'm probably not starting anybody on this offense outside of Josh Jacobs, assuming he's healthy, with Malik Willis as quarterback. We've seen Malik Willis take the field before in Tennessee, and he was awful. He looked lost in his, last play of the game snap with Green Bay. So I think it's a huge downgrade for guys like Christian Watson, Jaden Reed, Romeo Doubs especially. I think this is something where you can still play Jaden Reed because the team is going to get him the ball regardless, manufacture those touches. But Christian Watson, who's a guy that I'm very much into, is someone that I will not be starting unless I have to. And I think I'm going to take more of the wait and see approach. But he is still a deep threat. A lot of people, if you have somebody like Watson, you probably don't have a lot of other options in Dynasty to, switch him with in the lineup. So you might just be throwing him out there and seeing how things go. But I wouldn't have very high expectations with Willis throwing him the ball. Now, Justin Fields with the Pittsburgh Steelers, he got the week one start. And this, of course, is exciting for fantasy because he's a much higher ceiling in terms of fantasy points than Russell Wilson. So one thing I'll be watching for is, can Justin Fields play well enough to secure that job? Can he take the quarterback job away from Russell Wilson and keep it? Can he, deliver them another win? Can he produce fantasy points? He ran the ball a lot last week, but he didn't have any touchdowns passing or rushing, so that, hurt his overall output at the end of the day. But Pittsburgh did win. They did beat Atlanta. Their defense played great. So we'll see what Justin Fields can do this week, but he's somebody that I am watching in week two. The Cincinnati Bengals were probably the biggest disappointment of all overall, just, playing New England, a team that everyone thought the Bengals should beat. And it was just an all-around ugly performance for the Cincinnati Bengals. Joe Burrow did not look good. Jamar Chase was only mediocre. T. Higgins out with an injury. The running game didn't look great. So just pretty bad all around. Chase Brown, somebody that I expected big things from, was the backup to Zach Moss, which in hindsight maybe was something I should have pushed back on a little bit more, but I did get pretty caught up in the Chase Brown hype. So still have high hopes there, but it does not look, at least as of right now, that he is going to be somebody that you can put into your lineup until we see more of a 50-50 split. He is a big play type of guy, so he's going to break out with, a big touchdown at some point. It's just a matter of, will he have done enough leading up to that for him to be in your lineup? So a little bit worried there. I'm worried about the passing attack, between injuries with T. Higgins, just kind of mediocre play overall out of Joe Burrow. So we'll see how things go there. Atlanta, another team that just really struggled on offense, but they don't have to deal with TJ Watt this week. So can they turn things around? Kyle Pitts had a solid week one. Drake London, not so much. Bijan Robinson looked great, but Kirk Cousins, looked like an old man with an Achilles injury. So is he going to bounce back from that? The team says he's fully healthy. It is a first game with a new team, new offense, so I'm willing to cut him a little bit of slack here at the start of the season, but he's got a tough schedule, and, he's got an uphill battle to, being the Kirk Cousins of the past couple years with Minnesota. So my advice there would simply be, if you are a Kirk Cousins manager, you should start sending some offers for Michael Penix Jr. because if this continues for a month or two, Michael Penix is going to see the field sooner rather than later if Kirk Cousins looks as bad as he did in week 1 for, the first half of the season. Elite tight ends around the league. We just mentioned Kyle Pitts, but tight ends in general struggled a lot. We didn't see any big games out of, Sam Laporta or Travis Kelce. Mark Andrews really struggled. So a lot of these guys, Dalton Kincaid, Trey McBride, sort of the top 5 or 6 tight ends that people were really drafting and looking forward to, didn't do a lot. So the biggest tight end performance on the week was Isaiah Likely, who, seems to be creating a dent in Mark Andrews' workload. So while I don't think that that's going to be something that, happens every week, of course, I think that's, Mark Andrews is still going to be productive. Something to pay attention in there, but elite tight ends just across the league, I think we'll see a bit of a bounce back as, the quarterbacks and the offenses get up to speed a little bit more. We had a lot of teams that didn't play their starters pretty much at all in the preseason. Teams like the Lions were included in that. So I just want to see, do we get that week 2, week 3 bounce where those players, establish themselves again as kind of the centerpieces of some of those offenses. Derrick Henry is somebody that typically has been a centerpiece of his team's offense, but not so much anymore in Baltimore. It was a bit of a concerning week 1 for me with Derrick Henry because he was taken off the field a lot, third downs, passing downs, 2-minute drill, things that we kind of expected, but it just wasn't, he didn't look great. The team, it wasn't the Derrick Henry of old, which I think is something that everyone is a bit worried about. He did have a modest game for fantasy, which it seems like he's somebody that's going to be a touchdown or bust type of player, which is what we've been afraid of over the last couple of years, and he's managed to avoid it by just having this enormous volume. But I don't know that the volume is going to be there the way that it was in Tennessee. So if he's getting half or 2/3 of the carries that he's used to getting, and you take off 30, 40 yards per game, it's going to be rough. He's not getting any passing work. Justice Hill saw the field a lot. So, kind of little warning light flashing for Derrick Henry. And then last but not least, before we move on to our panic meter, J.K. Dobbins. Is he fake? Is he for real? What are we going to get from him? He had an awesome week 1. Still, a little bit skeptical, but he seemed like the guy to have in that offense over Gus Edwards, over Kamani Vidal, who didn't even play. So J.K. Dobbins has all the chance in the world here to kind of reestablish himself as, a higher level fantasy running back, especially in a Chargers offense that really wants to run the ball. So he's somebody that I will be keeping an eye on in week 2. I think if you need to start him, you absolutely can. He's got a good matchup against Carolina. So he's another name that I will absolutely be watching here in week 2. All right, so now a segment that I don't know how often we'll do this, but I think periodically throughout the season at a minimum, I want to do this segment where we bring up the panic meter on a scale of 1 to 10. Is it time to panic on these 10 players that had bad week 1s? So the panic meter will have 1 as being, no panic at all, not worried. 10, just red alert, lights flashing, absolutely panicking about this player, and then a 5 being, right in the middle, just a moderate panic, definitely some worry, but not to the point where you're just, doing anything to trade a player away, things like that. So, and then after this segment, we'll get into our sleepers for this week, along with 2 players that want to give you a confidence boost on starting. So I don't know if it's entirely would fit in the category of a start of the week, but it's something along those lines. So we'll get to those in just a few minutes. But first, the 10 names from week 1. Is it time to panic? I'm going to start with probably the biggest name in fantasy football, Christian McCaffrey, who missed week 1 with an injury, came out at the last minute, really affected a lot of matchups, unless you had Jordan Mason on your bench to back him up and you were able to plug him into your lineup. He was great. Just an important reason to have your running back handcuffs, especially when it's clearly established who that is. Or it's a dynasty league where you have a big bench and you can, swing a small trade to make that happen, because you really want to protect yourself from these types of situations. And the more news that came out about McCaffrey, I think the worry that I had rose a bit, because it's not just a calf injury. There's this Achilles tendonitis, and it's something that I think is going to bother him for probably the rest of the season, probably the rest of his career. I mean, this is something that he might not be fully 100% healthy ever again. Now, is that going to mean that he's not going to be productive for fantasy? No. I mean, he could absolutely still be the running back 1 in the season, especially if he, gets back on the field in week 2. But I think it's something where we could see a slight reduction in workload. I think that Jordan Mason probably has earned a few carries, and they just want to keep him fresh. San Francisco's a team that expects to be in the playoffs, expects to have Super Bowl, aspirations, things like that. So I don't think they're going to just overwork him. So on the panic meter 1 to 10, I am at a 6 with Christian McCaffrey, because I think with Christian McCaffrey, he's somebody that for the longest time I was of the opinion that you just ride him out for his entire career. You don't trade him away, even though he's hitting that age cliff. I'm starting to wonder if that is still the proper way to handle CMC, and it probably is. I think if you have Christian McCaffrey, especially if you're a team that has any chance of making the playoffs and winning something in your leagues this year or next year, you're probably just holding on, enjoying the ride until it's all over. But this is something where if you're not a true contender, you should definitely be looking to make a move here now. Maybe the best time to trade him would be when the news drops that he is, he's going to be back, he's going to be playing in week 2, or if he misses week 2, whenever the news drops that he'll be back for week 3. But I'm a bit worried about this injury. It's something that seems like it could be just a nagging injury, and just slow him down a little bit. So a 6 on the panic meter for Christian McCaffrey. Next up is Bryce Young, who is a player that I was worried about all summer, and that worry has, carried over into the regular season, and he looked bad. He looked really bad. The Saints absolutely destroyed the Panthers in week 1, and Bryce Young didn't look good. He threw an interception on his first throw of the game, and again, I just haven't seen anything in a Bryce Young that would lead me to believe that he can be a franchise quarterback. Now, with all that being said, that means on the panic meter, he's going to be a 10. I am absolutely in red alert on Bryce Young. I am actively looking to trade him away. I do not want him on any of my rosters. I only have him left in, I only had him in the first place in one league, and I am still actively looking to move on from him. I would encourage you to see what is out there, because he still does have some value, because he's not worthless. This isn't something where he has no hope at all. There is still the possibility that he turns into a good NFL quarterback. And as we've seen, especially this past week, quarterbacks are still king in Superflex Dynasty leagues. So if he can develop into a startable, QB2, somebody that you can have as a third QB in your team, or a low-end QB2, I think that's still a valuable asset. But as of right now, I just don't see him, turning into that. And I'd be worried that Carolina could replace him probably as soon as next year. Now, I don't know how realistic that truly is. I think he would have to be, probably generationally awful the rest of the season. And the team, given that they spent so much to get him, might give him a third year regardless. But I'm down on Bryce Young overall. I'm worried about his weapons. Although I still think that, Adam Thielen can be a nice, kind of sneaky bye-week flex starter on a team if you need one. But Bryce Young is at a 10 on the panic meter. Next up is another quarterback, Caleb Williams, who he didn't even reach 100 yards passing in his first career start. The Bears offense looked awful. They won the game almost entirely because of their defense. So, however, with all that being said, Caleb Williams only gets a 1 on the panic meter. I am not worried about Caleb Williams at all. This is the first game for the number 1 overall pick. He's a rookie. He played a good defense. He made some nice throws. It wasn't a great performance, but it's not something that's going to worry me after one game. If you drafted Caleb Williams in your dynasty leagues, that means you probably had the 101 and your team was having a bit of a rough season. You're in a rebuild. So having the time to be patient, is going to be there for you. You shouldn't be in a rush. So I'm not worried one bit. I think he's got the weapons. He's got, pieces around him to be successful. Now, if he continues to look this way, and then we get to week 10 and he's still just, throwing about 100 yards a game or, not, taking advantage of his weapons, then we'll have a different conversation. But for now, I'm not there yet at all. Just a 1 on the panic meter. Another rookie, though, that really struggled, Marvin Harrison Jr., who probably went number 2 in most of your rookie drafts in the spring. And Marvin Harrison looked slow. He didn't even he had 1.4 fantasy points in PPR leagues. Not great. 1 catch. Really an awful performance in week 1 against a defense that he should have been able to get more done against in Buffalo. But the panic meter for Marvin Harrison Jr. is only at a 2. I'm really not worried. I'm very, very mildly concerned about the possibility that he might just be really slow. But we watched him at Ohio State. He was the first wide receiver taken for a reason. He's in a good offense. I'm just not worried about Marvin Harrison Jr. And I think that now is a good time. You can take advantage of some potential panic in Marvin Harrison Jr. managers and get a trade done. I've now seen in 2 leagues, Marvin Harrison get traded for less than what I think he is worth. So it's worth poking around, seeing what it might take. I think he was being completely overdrafted in redraft. I think that the idea that he was going to return value as a second-round pick was insane. And I mentioned that over the summer that it just wasn't worth it. But in terms of dynasty, I think he still carries plenty of value. He's going to be just fine. I'm not worried yet. Again, just like Caleb Williams, we'll check back at the midway point of the season and see how things are going. But for now, just a 2 out of 10 on the panic meter. Next up, back to the quarterbacks, and we got a few of them in a row here. So Deshaun Watson, who the Cleveland Browns starting quarterback, and he was awful. I mean, we're talking Bryce Young levels of bad. It was rough. Threw a couple interceptions. He did run the ball a little bit, though. So that is still something that he does bring to the table. Played a very good defense in Dallas. And that game was over, relatively quickly. Dallas was just all over Cleveland. So on the panic meter with Deshaun Watson, I'm at an 8. I've been down on him all year. I was down on him last year. I just have never been a huge believer in him ever since he missed so much time. He wasn't good when he first came back. He still isn't good now. So the panic meter definitely is an 8. He could be higher, but I think for me, I'm not as shocked by this. I expected him to be bad. So would I be trying to trade him away? Yes, absolutely. But I do think that it is an interesting situation with Watson because he's been so bad, and I think people just in general are so down on him. I don't know that you're going to be able to get a whole lot for him. And because he does still have a rushing upside, which is so valuable in fantasy football, you might just be better off holding on to Deshaun Watson in a Superflex league. He has that locked in huge contract. I don't think he's going anywhere, even if he does continue to play poorly. The team is going to have to pay him either way, so I don't really think that there's any reason for them to move on because they wouldn't be getting the benefit of not paying a quarterback. They wouldn't be saving money. So he is the guy, and he's going to give you a lot of dud weeks, but he probably still will have a couple spikes throughout the season. especially when he runs for a touchdown. So for those reasons, I think the value has dropped so low that I think you might be able to hold on. But you certainly should not be counting on him as one of your week-to-week starters as a contending team. So panic level for Deshaun Watson is an 8. The next quarterback is Joe Burrow, and he's on this list because he was awful week 1 as well, as many of the quarterbacks were across the league. But Joe Burrow is somebody that we have high expectations for. I mean, this is somebody that we expect to be a QB1 week in, week out, first-round startup pick, a Super Bowl caliber QB, and he did not look like that against New England. And then there was the whole water bottle incident that we saw on social media. Is his wrist still bothering him? I don't know how much I buy into that, but I do worry a bit that one of two things. Either there is still some sort of nagging, lingering issue from an injury standpoint, or he's the type of player that just takes time to warm up in the season. He did not look good last season in the first couple months before he was injured. So I guess the question is it a trend where he has taken a step back, or, does he just take some time to get warmed up? Does he need some time to get back into things after the injury? So for now, Joe Burrow is at a 3 on the panic meter. I have mild panic, just a slight worry per se. But it is absolutely something that I'm going to keep an eye on, because I think that Joe Burrow is one of those players that if he continues to struggle with great wide receivers, I mean, when you have Jamar Chase, we expect T. Higgins back at some point. You expect great production out of your quarterback. So we'll check back in a few weeks on Joe Burrow, but for now he's a 3, but somebody to absolutely keep an eye on. Another quarterback that I think I mentioned earlier, somebody that we're going to be watching, but Kirk Cousins from the Atlanta Falcons. On the panic meter, I'm going to give him a 5 out of 10 because I have some moderate panic with him because of his age, coming off the Achilles injury. He has weapons again, but he still just, wasn't able to get them the ball, and no mobility at all. And he was never mobile to begin with, but now he has even less. So he's got that top 10 quarterback pick in Michael Penix Jr., breathing down his neck. So he does have the big contract he just signed. He's not going anywhere this year or next year. However, he could find himself on the bench eventually if he continues to look bad. Now, again, it's only 1 week. He's a veteran. He's kind of earned the right to have a couple of bad games before people really start to get on him. But I do think that the injury is probably still affecting him a bit, and the schedule is rough, and that's why he gets a 5 out of 10 on the panic meter, and is somebody that I'll be watching again in week 2. Switching positions now, no more quarterbacks. We got 3 more names, and next on the list is running back DeAndre Swift from the Chicago Bears. So we talked about Caleb Williams and how that offense was just so bad. And we gave Caleb Williams only a 1 out of 10 on the panic meter, but DeAndre Swift, I'm going to go with a 7. And that's because while I think it's perfectly acceptable to give time for Caleb Williams to develop and Rome Odunze and just the offense in general to improve, DeAndre Swift is, a running back on a second contract. He's on his 3rd team. He's not old. He's only 25, but he's not a 21, 22-year-old. He doesn't have just tons of time left as an effective starting running back, 2 or 3 seasons. And I am very worried about him. He looked bad. The offense needs to pretty significantly improve for him to carry some real significant value. And I mentioned him being a player that I was worried about over the summer as a potential bust candidate. We see it all the time with running backs that switch teams, and this is one of those situations. It feels like a trap, and so that's why he gets a 7 out of 10 on the panic meter, because I don't see the Chicago Bears offense improving anytime soon. I think it's going to be a little bit. There was a lot of hype in Chicago around the Bears, and their defense is good, but I don't expect this to be a team where we're talking about how great their offense is for at least the next month or two, which I think really hurts DeAndre Swift's fantasy value. And another name that it's not one of the 10 we're going to talk about, but Cole Kmet, another one that fits into this category of I might be a little bit worried here because the passing game was rough. But not only that, but he was splitting a lot of snaps with Gerald Everett. So side note, bonus pick thrown in there. But Cole Kmet is somebody that I have some moderate panic about. Sticking at tight end, Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews are going to be the two names that we discuss next. Those are our final two players here on the panic meter. And Travis Kelce, I'm going to give him a 1 out of 10. I'm not worried at all about him. I'm certainly not worried about his play. The only thing that I would be worried about if I were a Kelce manager would be the threat of retirement at the end of the season. The dude has everything going for him right now in life, and he really doesn't have anything left to prove on the football field. He's going to be one of the greatest tight ends of all time. He's won the Super Bowl multiple times. He's set dozens of records. I mean, this guy has done everything there is. He's got his big podcast going. His brother just retired. He's dating the biggest pop star in the world. I mean, he could just walk away from football anytime he wants, and I don't think anybody would blame him for it. So that is the only fear that I have with him. I really don't have any worries about him on the field. Rashee Rice, Xavier Worthy, both awesome in week 1 for Kansas City, and I think you can absolutely start both of them. But I also think that Travis Kelce is going to continue, to get worked into the offense. He's going to be, Patrick Mahomes' go-to guy, even though Rice and Worthy both seem like they're going to be, upper echelon receivers in this league. Travis Kelce, as long as he is still on the roster, is going to be a high-level tight end. So I'm just not worried about it. We saw a little bit of this last year where he had some down weeks or just he wasn't. And this is what I'll say. I think if you're expecting him to be a 20 points per week, every week, no matter what kind of guy, I just don't think that's fair anymore. I don't think that's what he is. He's in his he's in his mid to late 30s. This is not somebody that I think you can expect to be getting, 10 receptions for 100 yards and a touchdown every game like we got accustomed to. I think there's going to be some relative dud games where it's, 3 or 4 catches and things like that. But he's still going to have spike weeks. We saw it in the playoffs last year that Travis Kelce is still absolutely capable of performing like a high-level wide receiver, really, and put up wide receiver type numbers. So panic meter, only a 1 out of 10 for Travis Kelce. Now, Mark Andrews, a little bit more panic there. Not a ton. I'm not going overboard here, but I will say Mark Andrews, I'll give him a 4 out of 10 for some slight panic. And that's because we saw Isaiah Likely, step onto the scene and just have a true breakout game against Kansas City, tight end premium leagues. I believe he finished with 30 points. So really great production. Something that I think if Mark Andrews had done, nobody would be surprised. And I think something to remember here is that Mark Andrews was banged up. He was in a car accident like a week or two before the season started, and he was, limited in practice a bit. So this is not something where I think he's just lost it and he's, number 2 on the depth chart. I think this was a mix of they wanted to get Likely involved because they know how talented he is, but also not wanting to just overdo it with Mark Andrews given the injury concerns, and he was banged up a lot last year too. So just working him in a little bit more slowly. That's kind of how I see it. I think he's going to be just fine. Now, I don't think that he necessarily is going to be the tight end 1 in the season. I don't know that that's in the cards anymore. I think, but he can absolutely still finish, in the top 5, in the top 8, something along those lines. So even though it was a rough week 1, he was still on the field. He still got targets. He was just taken care of pretty well by the Chiefs defense. And I would expect him to be able to get his moving forward. And we're not going to see 30-point weeks every week from Isaiah Likely. I think that he might have some spikes and certainly will be very productive should Andrews miss any time. But Mark Andrews, I'm not that concerned yet. It's just a mild, slight concern level, given the fact that I don't think you can entirely take likely off the field. It's going to be a lot of 2 tight end sets. And teams are still going to be looking to take away Andrews. So just something to monitor. But again, similar to kind of the Joe Burrow situation, this is not something where I'm all that concerned. All right. We have made it to the last segment of the show here with our I have 2 players that I want to give you a confidence boost for here in week 2, and then 2 players as sleeper candidates that I don't think will be in many people's starting lineups, but absolutely could be. And frankly, my confidence boost players for this week are probably not in a ton of lineups either, but they're probably more flex plays that I think you absolutely can and should play this week. So we'll start with the confidence boost players, and I'm going to start with a wide receiver. So the LA Rams with Cooper Kupp dominating and then Puka Nacua going on IR, there is space for a receiver to step up in that offense. We saw Tyler Johnson play well against the Lions, but the player that I think is really going to be the number 2 behind Cooper Kupp is Demarcus Robinson. We saw him have production in this role last year. I think he is absolutely going to be a starter this week and will be for the entire time that Nacua is out. So Demarcus Robinson, I absolutely prefer him over Tyler Johnson. I would fire him up, put him in your lineup if you need a flex, need a receiver. He should return some solid production, especially against a bad Arizona defense. So Demarcus Robinson, the first confidence boost for week 2. Next up is running back Brian Robinson of the Washington Commanders, who should be in a very positive game script against the New York Giants. He had a good week 1, reached the end zone, caught a couple passes, and this was all with Jaden Daniels running the ball a lot still. So Brian Robinson, I think, is in line for a great game. We just saw Aaron Jones dominate this team, and I fully expect that Brian Robinson will get a ton of carries. So if you're on the fence about plugging him into your lineup, I would make room for him. I think he's a very solid flex play, or even running back 2 if you're a running back needy team. I think he definitely fits into that category this week, and I would start him with confidence. Now my 2 sleepers for the week. So these are 2 guys. Interestingly enough, they are in the same games as Robinson. Well, the 2 Robinsons. And now that I look at it, I actually have a 3rd Robinson. So it's just the week of the Robinsons here on the Dynasty War Room podcast. And the first sleeper for me is going to be Wan'Dale Robinson of the New York Giants. And he's going up against Brian Robinson and the Washington Commanders, whose secondary stinks. I mean, Washington just absolutely got lit up by Baker Mayfield and the Tampa Bay Bucks. They did not have a good secondary last season. They still don't. Malik Neighbors was a little bit banged up at practice today. He should be fine. He should play, but still something to monitor. And Wan'Dale Robinson out of the slot, he got 12 targets in week 1. He had 6 catches, was absolutely involved. This is something where the Giants pretty much in every game will probably be trailing at some point. But it's a situation where Robinson could be catching a lot of passes, especially out of the slot. And if you need to plug someone in, if you had an injury from week 1, something along those lines, you're a little bit thin at receiver, Wan'Dale Robinson is somebody that I think you can absolutely play here in week 2. And last but not least, Greg Dortch, wide receiver for the Arizona Cardinals, who another slot receiver, smaller guy, but he had 8 targets in week 1, and he should have another high-scoring game on deck here against the Rams. So Greg Dortch, Demarcus Robinson playing together in that matchup. I prefer Robinson, but Dortch is somebody that in a deeper league, maybe in your 14-team league, 16, or your dynasty league starts a lot of flexes or receivers and you had some injuries, etc. I think that Dortch will produce enough to make you happy to have him in your lineup. So Greg Dortch is the final sleeper for week 2. So there you have it. Demarcus Robinson, Brian Robinson are 2 confidence boost players of the week. And then Wan'Dale Robinson and Greg Dortch, your 2 sleepers of the week for week 2. And that is all that we have for you today on the Dynasty War Room podcast. We're going to publish this episode right away, right after finishing it, because we know we have Thursday Night Football coming up tonight, the Buffalo Bills and the Miami Dolphins. We didn't touch on really much of anything in that game because I imagine that by the time most of you listen to this, it will be Friday or Saturday, so that's why we didn't really focus on anybody in that game tonight. However, big time matchup. I would absolutely, I think that Josh Allen's in line for a huge game again. I'm still going to be watching my boy Khalil Shakir, see what he can do. And we mentioned elite tight ends, Dalton Kincaid, see what he can do. Tyreek Hill absolutely will be in your lineup. Jalen Waddle. And then, of course, the running back situation tonight, a little bit interesting. We'll see if Devon Achane will be in the lineup, what he's able to do. But Jeff Wilson, somebody that you can certainly throw in if you're hearing this before game time. And then we'll see what Jalen Wright does as well. So there you have it. That's this week's episode of the Dynasty War Room podcast. We will be back again sometime midweek next week. Again, we won't be doing Monday episodes, but we'll be back at some point in the middle of next week after week 2. So thank you so much for tuning in. Again, make sure to follow us on your platform of choice. Go subscribe on YouTube and follow us on Twitter at Dynasty War Room. We appreciate you all, and we'll talk to you all next week.